Hindol Sengupta. I'm delighted that Dr. Gautam Sen has joined me from London. There's never been, perhaps in the recent past, a better time than today to talk about London. Yesterday in London, by some counts, 110,000 people, perhaps much more, gathered across London, blocking the entire city in a show of protest that has rarely been seen before from the so called conservative side of politics. Now, this furthers the already fracturing nature of British politics and indeed the city of London itself. Lots of things are happening there. A new political party is emerging under Jeremy Corbyn and some others. All of this, what does this all mean? The best person to talk about this is Dr. Gautam Sen, who, by the way, I think has now spent 55 years, I should say 50 years for him in London, but now I think it's 55 years in that country and knows it better than anyone else. Dr. Sen, welcome.
It's still about 5 months to go before I reach my 55th anniversary, though, of course, I am in India constantly. Yes, these are momentous times, a great deal of change.
Let's begin with this momentous time.
Years that I've spent here. Such large demonstrations from British patriots, I hesitate to call them right-wing because a lot of ordinary citizens were out there protesting. Yes, they were all waving the flag of St. George, which is associated with the right. The right, I think, did play a prominent organizational role, and many of the key leaders were probably from the so-called right. So this definition has become a bit less meaningful because the agenda of the right now is not quite the same as it was before, where it was very vocally and clearly anti-non-white. That is not really the case right now. Of course, we don't know where it will end, and it may again return to its traditional racist roots. But this protest is really about a number of things. The immediate catalyst.
I want to point out that this protest is about, Dr. Sen, one thing I want to point out so that all our viewers remember is that this came right after that ghastly assassination of the young conservative activist Charlie Kirk in the United States.
I don't think that was such a critical issue, but that is undoubtedly a backdrop of the motivation. This really is about growing widespread anger in Britain about the continuing surge of migrants from North Africa, Afghanistan, the Arab world, across the English Channel by the tens of thousands. I think the numbers have reached about 40,000 already this year, which is, I think, the highest total in some years. And people are also extremely resentful at what they regard as the government of Keir Starmer, according them something of a warm welcome, housing them in hotels rather than camps, giving them pocket money, SIM cards, and various other facilities. Some local governments are giving them breaks in fun day out. So in a country beset by economic problems and serious deprivation, this fuels the resentment against these people who've come across the channel. This actually is the immediate catalyst, and an important one, because this is not just a problem for which the Labour government can be blamed, though they have been singularly incompetent in dealing with it. There was a similar problem while the Conservative government was in power during Rishi Sunak's time as Prime Minister and before. And none of them really handled it very well. Rishi Sunak had a plan to send the terrorists, sorry, beg your pardon, this is a slip of the tongue, but not totally inappropriate, the illegal asylum seekers to Rwanda at vast expense, truly vast expense, in a holding operation before the decision was taken whether or not they should be admitted. Now, the process of deciding who can stay and who can go, and very few will be entitled to stay, has been taking a very, very long time, which adds to the expense of looking after them. And of course, more people come while you are still undecided about those who are already here. So it is actually a complete mess. The Labour Party has no plans. They keep talking about going after the criminals, basically, who are arranging for the boat rides. But really, this has not produced any results. And people are really very upset about this. This, in a way, is a coalescing of many other frustrations. The British economy is in the depths of a crisis from which there is no easy escape. And we will know in November how bad this is when the Chancellor Rachel Reeves presents her new budget. The British economy, I think, is now in £50 billion deficit. That is the shortfall they are talking about. It was 20 billion last year, and many of us thought, okay, we have taken the pain and this is over now. But now they're talking about an additional £50 billion. And there are very few sources of taxation from which amount of money can be extracted. Basically, the state has turned plunderer. They are hitting all kinds of investors very hard, and the very wealthy who are fleeing the country in large numbers to escape Rachel Reeves's tax plans. But now we have a phenomenon which is known as a Laffer curve of diminishing returns. The more taxes you impose, the fewer the resources you generate. And indeed, this may well have happened to the indirect VAT, the equivalent of India's GST imposed on private schooling, because the number of schools which closed was quite large. So the state sector had to accommodate these people at some cost. And the revenues from VAT from those who left the private sector was, of course, not accruing to the government. So there are a number of other instances like this. What is also happening is that investors are not stupid. The taxes imposed on so-called capital gains are without indexation. So people are paying taxes on their original investment, not on any gains they have made. For example, the real value of housing has pretty much fallen about 20%. So if you pay 18 to 24%, the current rates on your gains, this may well exceed the inflationary losses you have suffered. And investors are taking note. People are fleeing the market for becoming landlords, which is creating a shortage of rent-to-let properties and inflating the cost. So all of this is a mess. The other very big problem really for many people are, and I've just read up to 40% of people are saying they are striving very hard to save on energy costs. Now that problem hasn't really started this year. It's just about beginning because the temperatures are dropping and people are having to stay cold and choose food over staying warm. Now, all these things have upset people vastly, and we're talking about lots and lots. I think a good fifth of the people are below the poverty line, and many, many others, another fifth or more, are barely above it. And the poverty line is relatively low in the UK. It is not like Scandinavia or even France or Germany. So all of these problems have combined to beset the government, and people have become angry that their good tax money, and we're talking about billions of pounds, are being spent on people who are arriving illegally, mainly young men of military age. Unfortunately for the government and for the victims, some of these migrants have criminal records, and you have no way of knowing because they've thrown their identity papers, passports into the English Channel. Some of them are actually criminals, and they have committed some crimes, including of sexual violence like rape. And this has enraged people. In the area of Epping, which is just east of London, the borough of Epping and its local government took the UK government to the High Court to say housing these migrants in a hotel in the area, which had prompted huge and continuing protests by local people after a young woman was sexually assaulted, according to the council, was illegal because it indicated a change of purpose for the hotel for which permission was required. Now, the government has taken them to court and has won the court case, which has merely angered people even more. There are other protests outside hotels where these migrants are being housed, and it is not looking good. I have to say, putting on my social scientist hat, that despite all of this trouble and seriously unsettling situation, the British, for whatever faults may be attributed to them, are remarkably tolerant people. Indeed, I would say they are unduly tolerant. They may be upset, but they will tend to keep quiet and get on with their own lives. And therefore, this has not led to any serious outbreak of a law and order situation. The government has very unjustly and foolishly, in my opinion, accused these people, the tens of thousands in the streets of London, of being right wingers who will be fought to the bitter end. Now, this is not the way to deal with them. They need some understanding and they need some reassurance, and the government has lost its bearings. However, we cannot predict the future. As Professor Betts, a distinguished authority on civil disorder and guerrilla warfare from King's College, has been saying, there are beginnings of a situation where civil disorder will break out, where ordinary people have lost confidence in the government, and the government is unable to act in their interests or indeed even listen to them. And there may be riots because basically we're talking about Muslims. Muslims are on the whole pretty well organized, and they are sufficiently well organized to respond to violence in the streets. So this is a potentially deadly cocktail, and all it needs is a spark. If it breaks out in any one city, there is every likelihood that angry people will then take to their own streets in their own area. This is something the government should really worry about.
Now, Dr. Sen, there are two or three things here which are worth mentioning. There are other countries, namely, for instance, America, who also have a crippling debt situation, but for the fact that because the greenback is the global reserve currency, in that unique way, the America prints as much money as it possibly wants, and its debt keeps going up. Now, of course, that's not an advantage any other country in the world has. Certainly, Britain doesn't have. Now, that is a crisis. I wonder why a lot of people don't understand that, this kind of debt will finally be crippling. The other question is, of course, we're talking about the economic and the social part of it, Dr. Sen, but it seems to me, as we've been discussing offline also, something of the so-called Western civilization or way of life is coming undone. The edifice of the welfare state, which held it all together, is fundamentally coming undone, not just in England, but in other parts of the West too.
Yeah, they have the luxury of being able to issue more bonds, but it seems that active numbers of bondholders are not available. So the bond yield has been going up in the United States sharply because as the bond is auctioned, there's an insufficient take-up. The return has to rise, and the US situation is actually quite bad too. But in the UK, the bond market for long bond, that is 30-year bonds, has risen to a historic high of about 5.73. Now, this is a serious bind for the government because increasingly raised taxes are being used to repay the interest on previous debt. So as you raise taxes, the bond yield goes up even further because people lose confidence in the British economy, and you end up using the increased taxes, or certainly a part of it, to service the existing debt. Now, this is a very difficult, unfortunate situation. In the end, this is a symptom, a very important underlying symptom of a historic economic crisis. I could go on for this at length because I'm an economic historian. Economics. See, bottom line is that the welfare state in its current form, which is not extravagant, by the way, cannot be funded by the rest of the economy. The private economy is increasingly unable to fund this, and this is a particularly serious problem since the financial crisis of 2008, because the British economy hasn't grown and productivity is virtually zero. So there are no additional resources to fund the growing costs of the welfare state. Now, the reason why the cost has continued to grow while the economy and the GDP has been pretty much stagnant, there's been no rising living standards between 2008 and 2025. And middle class taxpayers earning what in the Indian equivalent would be about 53 lakhs of rupees are paying higher and higher taxes because the tax exempt limit has not been raised for many years. The inheritance tax limit at which you start paying taxes has remained the same since 2010. Now, the reason why the welfare costs are growing up is one, aging population means a higher pension expenditure. That's the most important underlying reason, that the proportion of people who are older is growing. Now, the British government has been increasing the age at which your pension entitlement will commence. Now it will be 67 years as opposed to 65 from 2031. For women, it used to be 60, and it is already 65, 56 for them already. So women had had a very sharp rise in their entitlement to pensions of 6 years. That's one part. Somehow the welfare state supporting people with various ailments, disabilities, has grown at an astonishing pace. You are given a grant of up to £750 or more per month. That's over 80,000 rupees for a range of disabilities from autism to basically low mobility. And the list is quite long now. Now, a very large number of young people below 30 are now entitled and claiming. Now, this bill has suddenly shot up, and the government's efforts to curb this bill by changing the law, changing the regulations, and making it more difficult to claim has been opposed by a huge segment of the Labour Party's very large majority in the parliament. So in a way, Prime Minister Keir Starmer is a prisoner of the backbenchers of his party, which is actually quite large. So he has not got the outright majority, and there are some difficulties in insisting that he will cut it. For example, they had reduced the entitlement to this energy subsidy during the winter for people at a certain level of income. In fact, if I remember correctly, pretty much all old people were entitled. Anybody who was a pensioner was entitled. They reduced that to, I think, about £11,000 annual income, after which you were not entitled to, I think, this about £300 or £400 in the winter, which for a lot of people is important, but they can't keep warm and old people get colder than others. They have now been forced by the backbench MPs to raise that to £35,000, which means the entitlement cohort is much larger and therefore it is costly. Now, all of these policies have put a huge burden on the exchequer, and now a lot of Labour MPs are arguing that the benefits for a third child be resumed. Child benefit, as it is called, is limited to the first two children. It's not a vast fortune. I think it's about £40 a week. And I think it's a little bit less for the second child, but it stops after the second child. But a lot of Labour MPs want this extended. Now, this is actually potentially a very costly business. So they are caught in a trap. They cannot offend the backbenchers willy-nilly, because we're not talking about 10 people. We're talking about scores of members of parliament who are upset. Combine this with the low poll ratings of the government. The government is extremely unpopular. And the succession of scandals which have overtaken the government. For example, the deputy prime minister basically had to resign, or I think she was told to go, because she used a complicated tax avoidance mechanism not to pay what is called stamp duty on house purchase, amounting to about £40,000 plus. Now, apparently it was perfectly legal, but it was considered to be in very poor taste of a member of parliament and minister who boasted of the immorality of great wealth and tax avoidance. Now, there are 5 or 6 other MPs, including one from East London of Bangladeshi origin, who's had to resign because the government of Muhammad Yunus in Dhaka has accused her of collusion with Sheikh Hasina in a scam involving a Russian contract. So there are a number of members of parliament and ministers who had to go. So the government's reputation is now rather poor. They are showing no signs of being in control. And people simply don't believe what they say, and there are constant U-turns. They say one thing and then they change their mind. Unfortunately for this country, unfortunately for the British political situation, there is no great confidence in the Tory party either. They are down to, I think, 120 seats. They are losing to the new Reform Party. Councillors, and in fact, yesterday, a member of parliament, a sitting member of parliament of the Conservative Party, has defected to the Reform Party. Conservative Party, I'm sorry, is led by somebody who is proving to be singularly ineffectual. I am watching her perform in parliament. She is sporadically quite articulate, but there is a lack of substance and lack of judgment in how to deal with the issues. And people are fed up. Now, let me come to the Liberal Democrats. The Liberal Democrats are almost always the beneficiaries of discontent with the other parties. And they have made some progress because of that. They are birds of the same feather. They are no different. People are saying
It's
reform.
interesting. Much more than the Liberal Democrats or even the Reform Party at the moment, the most interesting political force in British politics seems to be this new independent party called Your Party that has been created by, Jeremy Corbyn and some other people. All right. I mean, that seems to be very, very interesting.
Yes, I mean, let me come first quickly to the Reform Party. No, let me first address your question. This party has only recently been formed by former leader Jeremy Corbyn, who is a very committed left-winger and an ardent supporter of the Palestinian cause. And that, by the way, is one of the reasons why people are angry. Pro-Palestinian demonstrators have been blocking the street and holding sit-ins and damaging RAF airplanes all over the country, attacking British companies, supplying goods to Israel. So people are also angry about that. But Jeremy Corbyn and this woman, Sultana something, a former Labour member of parliament, have become rather popular according to surveys. They enjoy a lot of support. And really, it is an expression of people's anger and frustration. They are wanting to punish the two major parties. And they cannot, in the last 3 weeks, have come to know everything Jeremy Corbyn and his Pakistani colleague, Mirpuri colleague, actually represent in substance, what they actually stand for, except they are for the poor. But that is simply a way of mobilizing the Muslim vote. The Muslim vote by
Zara
itself.
Sultana. I just looked up her name, Zara Sultana.
Zara Sultana. Now, the Muslim vote by itself cannot make an impact. So they have to say, we are for the disadvantaged. So then it becomes a larger cohort. So the Muslim vote, in combination with disaffected working class and others, could make an impact electorally. I don't think it will come to very much. It will peter out because you need money and you need organizational strength to sustain yourself. And they really are far too small. But they are showing in the polls that they are popular. Now, reform has done much better. They have often surged to second place in local elections. They've won some seats, and people are beginning to think they are the answer to the problems of the UK. I'm afraid to disappoint them. Reform is as much a symptom as anything else one can imagine. They are not a solution to the problems of the United Kingdom because I see nothing in their policy which inspires confidence. Their spending plans, their taxation plans, these are simply of no merit. But people are not voting for policy. They are expressing their frustration. So if reform comes to power, people will remain in the soup. They won't be from the frying pan into the fire because they're already in the fire. It will simply be carrying on in the fire. You see, the issue is like this. And this is the historic part that I hesitated to adumbrate. Britain's problems actually date back to the 19th century. I won't go back that far. It inherited a particular industrial and socio-economic and political structure which was incompatible with the new world being created in Germany in the 19th century and the late industrializers like France. These countries emerged wrecked from the Second World War and put in place new forms and structures of economic management. And after a war, it is much easier to make for radical reform, which they did. And it led to a period of sustained growth. For the UK, the inherited structures made them a prisoner of the past. And if you read carefully the history of economic policy in the late 1950s and 1960s, as I'm doing in some very splendid popular histories, the people who ran this country were not fools, either in the Conservative Party or in the Labour Party. But the problems they were encountering were not amenable to short-term fixes. So they just coasted along, did what they could, but the long-term problems persisted. They did not change, came to a crisis with the oil price hike of 1973, and then the huge trade union unrest, again a product of economic stagnation. And then Margaret Thatcher came and basically dealt with the unions in a very harsh way, but in the process, she also dealt a pretty fatal blow to British manufacturing, which was tottering, disorganized, chaotic, car production, machine tools, but she delivered the coup de grace. After that, there's been a period of service-led growth, which was killed off by 2008. So getting out of this bind and entering a new world is very difficult for a simple reason for Britain. It is partly what they've inherited, and partly because Britain, as a small, medium economy, as a medium-sized economy, is a price taker. It is not a price maker. Maybe in some very few sectors. So it has to continuously adapt to the world economy and external forces. Now, this is painful. Britain is not Singapore or Hong Kong, small population, no unionization. There is resistance to this constant adaptation that will be required. So this is proving very difficult. The financial crisis of 2008, compounded by COVID, which actually is a reason for the huge public debt, has made it very difficult for anybody to maneuver. And I would say that ruling parties have not managed a difficult situation very well. They've coasted along. My condemnation of the political class is that they really are showing signs of bankruptcy, which in itself is a product of the difficult circumstances. They are not able to cope. And solutions are all bad solutions. They're all painful solutions. You cannot turn this country upside down without a major crisis which leaves no choice for ordinary people. And even the
I want to ask you, Dr. Sen, you mentioned Professor Betts earlier of King's College London and his prognosis that this will lead to really vicious fractures in society at all kinds of levels, and which could even lead to a civil war of some kinds. From the kind of demonstrations London has been seeing for the last 1 year, actually. I mean, we saw the, 200,000 people maybe gather in London about these Palestinian protests and so on and so forth. Yesterday's protest. Now there are, earlier in the day when we were talking offline, you were talking to me about a range of protests and strikes by railway people who want, in the middle of all of this, they want a 4-day week and a hike in salary. Do you believe that some sort of flashpoint is being reached, as in there will be some uh, point which will, genuinely showcase this failure in quite a gruesome light?
What is happening now is quite unprecedented, if only because no obvious solution is in sight. You see, then in October, November, we will know how bad things are. And I don't think, they have any policy package ready, which is why the bond markets are nervous. The rising cost of bonds is due to the fact that they do not believe the government will have credible policies. This happened with Liz Truss earlier. But Liz Truss's problem was that things became problematic very quickly. Therefore, the bond markets reacted. Whereas now, the problem is unfolding more slowly. So there is no immediate crisis requires massive Bank of England intervention. You see, there is no money to fund a crisis now. Britain is at 100% debt ratio, 100%. And the growth rate is actually zero, 1% or even less. So where is the money to service bonds at 5.3%? And they're talking about increased defense expenditure to fight Russia. It is really a comedy of the absurd. The war in Ukraine has also caused them great harm. The war in Ukraine has devastated the European economy, Germany, France included, Britain. The huge energy costs in the UK, which are some of the highest in the world, is due to the embargo on Russian energy imports, which has affected global prices as well. So that's one part. The other thing which one should not forget, that this chancer, an opportunistic prime minister who remains ex-prime minister, who remains very popular, none other than Boris Johnson, persuaded the people to vote for Brexit and won it by a very small margin. That has had very important economic consequence for Britain. I believe the losses have amounted to 100 billion pounds, the cost of leaving the European Union. European Union was Britain's largest single trading partner. I think 42% of British trade was with the European Union. And so many bureaucratic and other hurdles have emerged that the rest of the world cannot compensate for this loss of the European market. It cannot compensate. So this is something we have to live with. Many people who voted to leave the European Union, not from the southeastern London and Northern Ireland and Scotland who voted to stay, are the very people who are suffering its worst consequences because they have experienced a larger economic downturn. So this is the irony. And I don't see how they will square this circle. Now, there was great excitement, which Indians might like to know, about India riding to the rescue with a free trade agreement. My understanding was that India was not very keen, but they were bounced in this direction by foreknowledge of what was going to happen with the United States, because India's FTA was signed a little bit before the worst came to pass with Trump's 25% and then further 25% tariffs, the punitive tariff about Russian fuel. So the Indian side signed this FTA in anticipation of what was to come. So they knew something was afoot. And obviously, one of the gains for India of the FTA will be a rise in clothing exports, because Indian clothing exports before the FTA were subject to higher import duties than, say, Bangladesh or Kenya, which were classified as least developed. Now, India has been freed of that restraint. So some compensation will occur by British exports of apparel to the UK. So that was one reason. Britain also did not gain a vast amount. All the concessions that the Indians have made, if you look carefully, they are going to unfold over time, even for motor vehicles, other alcohol, not immediate. And as I've explained to you in an earlier program, Indian motor vehicle manufacture in the relevant sectors will become more and more competitive in the next 5 years. By the time the tariffs fall to 10% eventually at the penultimate stage. The same is true of whiskey. I do not think Indians are going to buy expensive malt in preference to the improving quality of Indian whiskey with a huge price differential. Once the novelty has worn off and people are regular imbibers of alcohol, they will go back to locally brewed alcohol, which actually is of pretty good quality and improving. And we have the weather to mature whiskey much more quickly than the UK. So anyway, be that as it may. So India riding to the rescue may not be everything is cracked up to be. But the one area where Britain has imposed some restraints for political reasons is the influx of Indian professionals. This was politically very difficult, but I understand. People told all sorts of lies about this in the UK. Oh, they're going to come and have free health care, but they will not pay national insurance. All of this is not true. They won't pay national, but nor will they have free health care. The ones who are coming here won't pay national insurance because they have no pension entitlement in the UK. National insurance is for a future pension entitlement. But the professionals would have made a difference. And I'm dealing with a part of southwest London called Maidenhead, which I visited for the first time. And I noted, talking to a lot of the entrepreneurs who are Indian, that it is prospering because of the influx of Indian entrepreneurs and their activity will radiate in the region from Reading to Slough and beyond, and then seamlessly connect to London. So these professionals have a spin-off effect. Now that will actually not be occurring to the extent which it might if lots of Indian professionals came. They might actually make England more competitive in key service sectors. But I accept that this is politically difficult while tens of thousands of people are rowing across the English Channel. So Britain and India will now enjoy free trade. Britain is signing with others. They have had a lower tariff imposed by Donald Trump for sentimental reasons than the European Union. And that will make a difference. But the problems are too huge to be addressed by these minor trade issues. And the worst part of this story is that they needed to have good relations with China now. China was potentially an important economy for them to cultivate, but that has become politically very difficult because that decision has been made in Washington. And for the UK, disobeying Washington is not an option and hasn't been since the Suez Crisis of 1956. So I have to say, I've lived here so long, and no matter what criticism you have and how much of disaffection some of their behavior towards Indians might be, you do develop an affection. And there are so many good qualities.
And of course, and that affection, of course,
yourself, they have very great qualities of which, tolerance, good humor, and of course, they're fabulous literature and poetry, great historians. There's so many things to admire and love that, they also have fabulous monuments all over the country.
That's right, Dr. Sen. As you were saying, there is much to admire, and many of us grew up in that culture of admiring, especially literature and culture and music that emanated from England. But as you say, the fundamentals are at the moment very, very shaky.
Well, I wish them well, though I'm very skeptical about what is possible. It will require an enormous effort of leadership. But, people who are now viewed as duplicitous and corrupt, as the Labour Party increasingly is, they are not going to be able to do this. And I'm making a prediction. This Chancellor will be gone by early next year. Rachel Reeves, she will be gone because there will be an economic crisis where the Bank of England may have to intervene, and it will be inflationary. And I don't think Keir Starmer will survive the entire term up to 2029. He may have to go before because the public disenchantment, you cannot survive as a government if your approval rating is below 15%. This will be very hard to justify. So I fear the difficulties will
Rating is
not be
below
resolved.
15%. Did you just say one
It's go-
five?
yeah, it's getting there. It is getting there. It is getting there. It's not far. And then I don't see how you can then survive on grounds of wisdom and morality or whatever. And but I don't see who will replace this government. Not reform, not Nigel Farage. He's a publicist, PR, but a lightweight. That is the kindest thing you can say about him. A lightweight, and he was very much involved in the campaign for Brexit, which, by the way, had some legitimate reasons. But in the round, it was a bad idea. In the round, it was a bad idea. So there we are. So I wish them well. What more is there to say?
Remember, I was in Brexit. I was holidaying in Cotswold when Brexit happened, as you know. And yeah, I remember people being, at least in Cotswold, being quite positive about the whole thing, though I was always a bit skeptical.
Yeah, when there's economic difficulty, people start thinking, we do it ourselves and we don't need these ruddy foreigners and they're messing it up. And of course, Britain has no such choice because if you're a very small economy, you'll adapt without so much domestic difficulty because your people will be used to it. If you're a very large economy like the United States, China, Russia, India, you have some capacity to absorb the changes and in fact even affect the global economy by your behavior. But if you're a medium-sized economy, you're caught in between. You can neither adapt nor can ignore the wider economy. And Britain's problem is it is a price taker. It needs to be agile. And the service sector is, in economic terms, what you'll end up with when you develop. But it is not a source of great productivity increases. And it's a very competitive field. And the worst part of the story is in the service sector, costs count. And the internet and technology has made it very easy for countries like India, Philippines to compete with you in the very sector in which competitive advantage should reside with you. So you are really caught out.
I think at some point there was a bit of a hope, maybe a few years ago, that the sharp decline in demographics would somehow balance this up. But that's not happening fast enough. I mean, that's really not happening fast enough at all.
On the contrary, there is a labor shortage because a disproportionate number of people who are young adults are not in the workforce. They're not working. 1 million people, 1 million, not all of them young, are getting at least 10% more than the minimum wage in welfare benefits. So 1 million people, that is 25,000 pounds a year, they're getting for sitting at home. Why will they come and work at the minimum wage of 22,000 pounds? So this is a mess. And they have made the bed on which they are being obliged to lie. And they are not capable of making a bed very well, I'm afraid. Neither Starmer nor Kemi Badnoch, and certainly not Nigel Farage.
You see this new party, I know you said it'll probably peter out because it doesn't have the finances and the backing. But do you think it could well turn out to be a bit of a outlier, black swan kind of at least disruptor?
At worst, they may split a segment of the Labour Party and take away some seats. But they are not going to be in a position to have an important influence on the formation of government. The likeliest outcome is that Reform and the Tories together will have the numbers when elections take place next time. But then they have to come to at least a tacit understanding not to put up candidates against each other, at least on the key seats where their competition will help a third party like the Labour Party or indeed Corbyn. So they will have to come to a tacit understanding if they're to survive. But the Conservative Party, which is the GOP, the grand old party, they are floundering. And they're not very well led. So I don't know where all this will end.
No, Dr. Sen, thanks very much for your time once again. As always, it's always wonderful talking to you about the West and especially about England, where you've spent almost 55 years now. Thanks very much for your time. No doubt we'll be back talking to you soon about other issues as all of this develops. Thank you.
Thank you, Hindol. Great pleasure.